walking through the trees right now, sort of approaching the evening sun. I was thinking about beauty today, and horror, and absolute acceptance, and how beauty doesn't really come from anywhere, which is why it sort of shocks us, short-circuits us into the absolute perspective on reality, the fact that reality is sort of fully here. Interestingly enough, the unfinishedness of reality only contributes to its absoluteness. As for beauty, beauty is random and irrelevant and tangential, and yet it doesn't really lead to anything. It's sort of pure structure, and yet rather than entirely experiencing it retroactively, we experience it rather immediately. And so the effect is sort of the pure abyss of freedom, or the pure abyss of the existence of reality. Again, the fact that reality in a totally disorienting way exists. And there's nothing we can do about that. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine today about his family and why Freud talks so much about castration, which for so many people is this kind of medieval term, but there's nothing medieval about it. It's extremely insightful, because Freud's point is basically like, you don't need a loving family because a loving family is essential to your development. And that therefore if you lack a loving family, that's the cause of all of your worldly and existential grief. Freud's insight is the opposite. He says, you sort of need to have a loving family so that you don't have an excuse for the fact that things are simply difficult, and not just contingently difficult, not just difficult practically or logistically, but difficult in a total sense. Reality itself is a point of almost pure disorientation. And castration is the developmental acceptance of some degree of sacrifice. Sacrifice as necessary for freedom. Freedom as sacrifice. Reconciling yourself, in other words, to the fact that nothing can save you except your own free choice to install ungroundedly some principle on the basis of which to live. And it is frustrating, of course, when our development is disordered. Again, not by some specific violent event or some specific loss, but by the impossibility of, even in our grief and loss, of ever being comforted. The friend of mine spoke about how he had a friend of his who had lost his father, and how the friend resented people asking him if there was anything they could do. And he said, there's nothing you can do. It's a total loss. And I think that this position is true. It is a total grief. But here's the thing. If the people had offered, he would have complained about the lack of those offers of warmth and support and friendship. And then he would have had this excuse not to have to face the absoluteness, not just of his father's death, but of our loneliness, of our isolation, of our total vulnerability to reality. And the same thing happens for Freud. In Freud's opinion, in the developmental context, we cannot have the excuse of an unloving family to convince us that our grief must have some cause, when, like beauty, it's totally uncaused. Which is why beauty is can feel like suffering. It can be so painful, it's beautiful, and so beautiful it's painful. I mean, that short circuit is otherwise inexplicable unless you understand the point of absolute reconciliation that we have to reach. And so even for Freud, even something as terrifying as incest, which has nothing to do with the specific episode, empirically, of that kind of sexual violence, but just with the fact that something like the mystery of sexuality never gets answered, and that we carry around the mystery for the rest of our lives, and that if we don't accept the burden of that mystery without at the same time just mystifying it, right, obscuring that it has to do with some kind of mourning we have to undertake for the world, well, if we don't, then we're not sort of castrated. We haven't found something worth dying for. And that sacrifice should be for reality in this ruthless, almost unlivable way, but anything else doesn't strike us as ethical. Which is why beauty and ethics are also related. So we have to accept castration not because of some medieval fixation of its own, but definitely because the burden of the sacrifice is the only way that we become free. It's the only way that we can understand that we sort of sacrifice ourselves for the world, or we sacrifice the world, as it were, for ourselves. We sacrifice its naive consistency, its naive causality, in order, for the sake of that freedom, to act what is now in an unfinished, or radically unfinished reality. You know? That's the choice. And every child confronts that choice. And sexuality is the ultimate metaphor for that choice, but also the ultimate example of biology upset. All the naive causal determinedness of the human being gets upset in sexuality, in desire and sexual drive. So that in order to become human beings, we have to more or less prostrate ourselves inside the absolute and accept it without really being able to explain why it's there or what the cause of anything is. We actually have to sacrifice causality itself in order to become human. This is reality. The fog over there, the trees, the sun, but it's all unfinished. How? Well, because fog and rain and sunlight are just physical systems. Pushed to their extreme, they'd break down. Their physics would break down. Hegel says we can easily reach the limit of any system once you make it self-conscious enough, reflexive enough. These things are not stable, they're just the pretension of stability. But the magic of it is that they install the very veneer of stability. In fact, that's all systematicity consists in, that's all nature consists in, the temporary veneer of stability. You know, in that respect, nature is the ultimate producer of ideology. But it's a totally dysphoric experience to realize that the horizon line kind of implicitly breaks down. There's this kind of unfinishedness written into it. The funny thing about technology or art is it gets very conceptual because it sort of portrays reality breaking down, and sometimes in a very crude, unprocessable way. But sometimes great conceptuality can be processed, and far from it repairing naive nature or reality, it can actually present it in its absolute unfinishedness, in its kind of absolute and cruel openness. But I suppose the paradox is, how do we survive in any of it? I mean, we're also sort of ideology, human biology and everything. We try and use metaphysics to recover some plane in which this all makes sense, but no amount of possibility can get rid of the sheer horror that it all exists, and we'll never find any kind of prime mover to explain that. only, you know, the rose and the cross of the present, as Hegel called it, the crucifixion of reason, you know, and maybe the mystery of faith could ever possibly not even explain it to us. Again, Kierkegaard says that there isn't any explanation in the incarnation, it's just the sheer example of the likeness. It's kind of horrifying. Again, there have been literary attempts to portray Christ appearing, and it is properly monstrous if you think about it, because we're monstrous, because we don't make sense. But our survival isn't disrupted by the fact that we don't make sense. On the contrary, there's not a single part of reality that makes sense. That's what contributes to the brutality of it all. And that's not just randomness. Remember, there's a difference between randomness and radical, unprocessable unfinishedness.